Some people misunderstood my video judging on the comments of the last video. When I said there were no black Africans in Asia that started those giant kingdoms, I did not mean there were no black people, because certainly Asia is dotted with a lot of tribes that would be considered black people. And if we do a rewind on my previous video, you can hear me say this.
Perhaps spoken by the Jomon and the Ainu people, Japan's earliest inhabitants who came from Africa and later intermarried.
If he means that they came of Africa through the out of Africa theory, then I agree. But if he means that they came in a more recent time from Africa, then I completely disagree, because we know that they didn't. And showing black and white pictures does not help to make it seem like these people were black Africans, because they most certainly were not. Now, judging by some of the comments that I got, a lot of people thought that I was on their side, where they said stupid things like, seems like they founded civilizations in every continent but skipped sub-Saharan Africa, which is a ridiculous thing to say, since there are tons of civilizations in sub-Saharan Africa. And have you noticed Africans founded many developed nations, but Africa remains underdeveloped? What the hell are you talking about? It's stupid as hell. Again, there's tons of civilizations in Africa, and Africa is not underdeveloped. Africa is very developed. But these types of comments widely miss what my point was. My point was only debunking the idea that West Africans created the Japanese kingdoms, but it had nothing to do with black people. And to make this clear, I will highlight the black people who founded and started these populations that eventually would lead to these civilizations in places like Japan, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, all over Asia, the Papuan areas, Easter Island. We need to talk about these places because we know that they contributed heavy into the genetic makeup of the modern Asians today, even as far as Japan. We start first with these very people themselves and their tribes. Now, the only reason I'm mentioning their tribes is because it will prove that they are long existent in these regions. So, the out of Africa theory. About 100,000 to 70,000 years ago, Africans move out of Africa and they go to Asia via the Middle East. And from there, they start to separate into four different groups, one representing a Polynesian, a Siberian, and a Eurasian population. The Eurasian populations would go to the western side of the world, representing that side of the world all by themselves. And then the East Asian populations would go another way. And then obviously a third being the South Asian populations. People think that East Asians, because they look different from one another in terms of color, have nothing to do with each other genetically. This is not true. But let's look at these civilizations. We start first with the Papuans. Let me first explain something about this map. When they say this Eurasian population, they don't mean Europe as in white people. They mean location. The people were located in this area that is called Eurasia. Everyone at this time, 45,000 years ago, was black. Every single person. The genes that would eventually create white people, in the sense that they had a gene that made them have a lower melanation, because there's no gene for making them white, they just have a lower melanated skin, would eventually develop twice in history, one in the East Asians and then one in the, well, Eurasians that remained behind in Eurasia. But how do you prove that black people are related to Asians in this way? These black Asians are related to other East Asians. Well, first we start with a place that everyone would not disagree is part of Asia. And we start with the indigenous populations of the area, Taiwan. The Paiwan people of Taiwan are the most indigenous group of that area, and they represent the original people before the Han Chinese moved in there. These people may look to you like typical Asians, and that's fine. The only problem is they are genetically Melanesians, meaning that they themselves are related to all the other populations that are melanated in that region. As we read from Wikipedia, Taiwanese indigenous peoples are Austronesians with linguistic, genetic, and cultural ties to other Austronesian peoples. Taiwan is the original and linguistic homeland of the Oceanic Austronesian expansion, whose descendants groups today include the majority of the ethnic groups throughout many parts of East and Southeast Asia, as well as Oceania and even Africa, which includes Brunei, East Timor, Indonesia, Malaysia, Madagascar, the Philippines, Micronesia, Island Melanesia, Polynesia, the Chams and Utsul of contemporary central and southern Vietnam, and the Hainan, respectively, are also a part of Austronesian family. What this means is that these people, though they might look slightly different in terms of color and hair texture, are actually part of the same group. Not in some hypothetical way, not in some romantic way, but in some realistic way. Now, if we look at the people from Madagascar, we know that they came from these or this expansion because they still speak languages that are related to those people. These people from Madagascar would also represent another group of these people that would go all the way to the Americas, 1,500 years before Europeans ever did it. And there's a 2020 study about this. But before we talk about their achievements, let's continue to talk about their populations. So, for example, if we look at the majority of them, they are what you would consider black people. They represent this because, of course, the majority of people in the world, there's this thing that people think Caucasians are like the default human because of what's been going on with globalization. But the default look is a black African look, which some people associated with East Asia and other places, but it's a black African look, broad nose, mid to full lips, and a typical epicantic eye fold. This is Africa 101. But obviously, there's a deep separation, and 40,000 years separation, even from the earliest Asians, you're not going to get a language that's going to survive that. That's why the European languages are nothing like East Asian languages, and that's why the East Asian languages are nothing like African or European languages, and even nothing like the Indian languages. Because again, wide separation. So why is it though that these islands are different than what would happen in the mainland of China? Simple. The Ice Age. The Ice Age isolated the people from mainland Asia from these islander people. And so these islander people had their own sort of, let's call it micro evolution, very, very micro evolution, but they were still genetically related to these people, way close to the mainland people of Asia. Well, isn't Japan an island? Well, what we do know about the Jomon is that they too were a black separation from these people in mainland East Asia, and they were then visited by a Austronesian group. As we read from a study of 2021 called Ancient Genomes from the Initial Jomon Period, New Insights into the Genetic History of the Japanese Archipelago. Starting 16,000 years ago, the Neolithic lifestyle known as the Jomon culture spread across the Japanese archipelago. Although extensively studied by archaeologists and physical anthropologists, little is known about the genetic characteristics of the Jomon people. Here we report the entire mitogenome and the particular nuclear genome of the skeletal remains from the initial Jomon period that were excavated from the Higashimyo Shell Midden site at Saga City, Kyushu Island, Japan. This is the first genome analysis of the initial Jomon people of Kyushu Island. These results provide important data for understanding the temporal transition and regional differences of the Jomon people. The mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome haplogroup was similar to those found in the previously reported later Jomon people. Moreover, comparison of three nuclear genomes from the initial to final Jomon periods indicate genetic continuity throughout the Jomon period within the Japanese archipelago, with no significant evidence of admixture. This indicates that the genetic differentiation found among the Jomon people was promoted by the progression of regionalization throughout the Jomon period, further accumulated of high quality Jomon genome data spanning a wide range of regions and ages will clarify both intimate regional and temporal differences of the Jomon people and details of their admixture history and rice farmers as suggested by Jomon mitochondrial genome data result obtained from this study provide important information for further analysis. Mark J. Hudson, someone who studies the cultural diversity of Japan from the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology, said in the paper, this paper examines Neolithic cultural identities in the Ryukyu Islands of southwest Japan. It is argued that there were two different identities in the archipelago, a Jomon identity in the northern and central Ryukyus, and an Austronesian identity in the southern Ryukyus. These identities were constructed despite broad similarities in the substances adaptation in both cultural zones. The Hyoto of Japan represent a group that is also indigenous to Japan, and this group, despite its separation from the Jomon, has this effect that most people who study it think that they themselves come from Austronesians. And in fact, this is what this paper is about. And so if you look here, if we just read it from Wikipedia, the Hayato, which is Japanese word for Falcon people, were a people of ancient Japan who lived in Satsuma Osumi regions of southern Kyushu during the Nara period. They frequently resisted Yamato rule. After their subjugation, they became subjects of the government under Ritsuryo, and the Ministry of the military had an office known as the Hayato Shi in charge of their governance. The name also came into use by samurai as a title, Hayato Nosuke. In modern times, Hayato is a Japanese male given name. Now that we're introduced to these people, let's go back to the study that talks about the possible Austronesian people of southern Ryukyus of Japan. Jomon people do not appear to have crossed the 250-kilometer gap between Okinawa and Miyako Island. The Sakashima Islands of the southern Ryukyus were settled around 4,300 years ago by a quite different group of peoples, who seem to have come not from Japan, but from somewhere in Taiwan and or Southeast Asia. Two Neolithic cultures are known from the southern Ryukyus. The early Neolithic dates to around 4,300 to 3,500 years ago and is characterized by sites with pottery that is completely unlike anything known from the Jomon. Between about 3,500, the region with no evidence of a human settlement. The next late Neolithic phase dates to around 2,700 to 900 years ago and is characterized by shell adzes and by the absence of pottery. Again, there are no artifacts that suggest a relationship with the Jomon or later cultures of Okinawa, and based on the presence of the shell adzes, the Philippines is thought to be the possible source for the late Neolithic culture, while agriculture was, of course, being practiced in the Philippines and elsewhere in Southeast Asia at this time. The late Neolithic southern Ryugus appear to have been based on hunter-gathering. This would then suggest that farming in Japan was brought to Japan by Austronesians. These Austronesians, as we talked about earlier, are related to Madagascans and other people of Melanesia, Polynesia, and stuff like that who represent a black race. This might be the start of Japan as we know it today. And of course, the Yayo culture is the culture that would come and be more responsible for what Japan is today. Now, before we talk about the Yayo people who are Han related, who went and made even China whiter, and then made Japan whiter, let's first talk about um, what the DNA says about the people of Japan. So before we read the study, let's first go back to Wikipedia. And it says recent full genome analysis in 2020 by Boer et al. 2020 and Yang et al. 2020 reveals some further information regarding the origin of the Jomon people. They were found to have largely formed from a Paleolithic Siberian population and an East Asian related population. Gaku Hari et al. 2020 stated that the Jomon had strong genetic affinities with Taiwanese or Aborigines. Now we've been here before. Who are these Taiwanese Aborigines? Oh yeah, these Taiwanese Aborigines that we mentioned are Austronesian before the influence of Han Chinese. Well, so this study shows three things. One, it shows that the people from Russia and even Native Americans are related to these Japanese people. But not only that, it also shows that the Austronesians of Taiwan are also related to the people of Jomon who came in earlier and not the later ones, which would be seen as non continuous with this population in early Japan. And of course, modern Japanese people would have a closer genetic tie to Chinese people, though they still have some Jomon DNA and they also have some Austronesian DNA. But let us leave Japan for a while and head on down to the places where the Austronesians would be found. But before we do that, let's go to Native America, because remember, the people of the Native Americans who are related to these people, they themselves are not white, at least not all of them. The ones in Canada, you can find extremely pale ones, but if you go down to places like South America and even the Native Americans and all these people, they share this thing that we would find where people have broad noses, mid to full lips, and darker skin. And now let's return back to these people. Their achievements of these black people is so wide that it's not even known yet. We hardly find any boats from both Australia all the way to Africa, Australia to Japan, Australia to the Americas. But we know that they took boats because they had a boat culture, and they even still have the same word. This culture that is known as the Lapita culture is one of the most crazy cultures ever because they founded so many things, from landing in Bikini Island in the Americas to going to Hawaii, Somalia, all of these places, and then also landing in Madagascar, this giant expansion, and then Easter Island, and even coming out with their own script, creating giant statues that still puzzle people to this day, and meeting with Native Americans before we thought that the meeting ever happened. People talk about this great meeting that finally close the gap between the old world and the new world. But it turns out that gap was first made by these Austronesians, who were a island people who were isolated at one point, and the Japanese, or the people who traveled through that region of the Japanese areas and went all the way to the Native Americans first, were then met with the second population of these Austronesians who traveled there through these boats. In our recent, relatively, history, these people are something else, and their hunting strategies and everything was unique to their islands, because of course they lived in islands and not necessarily the mainland of Asia, so they don't have the distance or the bigness of the continents to work with, so they have to maintain stealth at all times because of their smallness of their islands. Big but small. These oceanic people are something else. I can't even explain it in words. I don't even know what to say. And they're dotted everywhere in Asia.